Welcome back to RSA Conference 2022. It's day 4. This is our last executive interview for the week. I'm your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me for this segment, Malcolm Harkins. He is the Chief Security and Trust Officer at Epiphany Networks, also a member of the board for CyberSec Alliance and an advisor to lots of companies. Welcome, Malcolm.
Thanks, Matt. Happy to be here.
So we were going to talk about risk management a little bit. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart because I spent a good chunk of my early career. I had this really crazy idea to build an early governance, risk management, and compliance software solution. I authored an algorithm that was patented and ultimately sold to a company called TrustWave. And I think about where we are today, right? And I think about this whole journey. I mean, this is 2003, 2004. Build out the software. I then went to RSA in 2012 to try to do some stuff with Archer. I don't know that we've ever fixed the risk management problem.
Yeah, it's challenging, right? Because risk has all these contours. Risk is also temporal. And so in many ways, it's like a Rubik's Cube that's constantly moving. Another way to think about it, when you start trying to calibrate perspectives on it, it's like a prism. And depending upon where you are sitting at an angle relative to the prism and the light intensity and the hue that you're shooting at it, you get a different reflection of the spectrum of possible risks. And so, what I learned early, almost 20 years ago, when I landed in security at Intel out of business roles, and we built this cyber risk calculator tool in Excel. It was like gazillion line items, right? Threats and vulnerabilities and consequences and all this math. And I had another former finance person who was an Excel whiz build this thing, and we almost dumbed ourselves down because we got focused on calculating risk rather than contemplating it. And then I took a tour of duty to fix Sarbanes-Oxley and stuff like that. And when I came back from that to go back into security, everybody was treating it like this magic 8-ball. Let's shake it, and the CRA tool will tell us what to do.
Right.
But it was so qualitative. And that's, I think, the challenge that we've had. People try and put these calculations on it, but they're so subjective with all this stuff that we're fooling ourselves with some score, because it's really all these qualitative opinions and biased data and opinions that goes into it. And then we go, oh, this is scientific. And frankly, that's crap. And so we've got to get better at really understanding that. And for me, it's also been a bit of a transformation. The risk equation we've been using for decades. It's a risk as a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. We've been using that for decades and decades and decades. And what have we done? We've drowning ourselves in noise because this is vulnerable and that's vulnerable, and the vendor who releases a thing says it's critical because they want to reduce their liability when it might not be that bad. And then how do you understand the context of all that? And so for me, I've experienced it, I've done it, I've seen it, and I think we're at a point in time where we have to redefine and transform the risk equation, and away from vulnerability management on the one hand, even though we can't eliminate it, but more towards exploitability. The exploitability of the enterprise to a material risk, a material exposure that would impact the business, shareholders, customers. And I think if we do that, we'll be more precise in really understanding risk and be able to better articulate it to the management team so we can make better choices and better decisions.
All right, so if we're going to go down this path a couple different ways. So we have lots of vulnerability data. Do we have enough exploitability data to really change the equation? Because we've got large vendors in this space. I've worked for 2 of them, lots of vulnerability data, and even there they've struggled with prioritization and integration into exploitability to understand priorities. If we move to this equation and we look at exploitability, what's the data source we use? Are the data sources there to actually change the equation?
Yeah, it's a great point. the reality is we have the data sources. What we're doing is missing the context between those data sources to truly identify and articulate that exploitability. Now, a lot of the prioritization schemes and the exploitability things that people have been doing the past couple of years are outside in, right? And they're threat intelligence feed based, which again is an approximation of things, but still based upon vulnerability. And it's better, and it's let's say reducing the sea of vulnerabilities by 15 to 20%, right?
Right.
Okay, great. The decent amount
So
of
the
incremental
IT team
value.
only has to patch 15 to 20% instead of 100% of the vulnerabilities.
Exactly. But the other way to approach it is to start from the inside out. Look at the prize, the system, the data, the identity that's going to create that, frankly, oh shit moment
Yeah.
and cause a material impact to the business. And when you start from the inside out, you can then start mapping the attack paths and the exploitability and those pivot points, right? We do it after the fact. We do an anatomy of a breach, and you go, okay, this got popped, and then we blame the user for that, and then it goes from here, and then they pick up an identity, and they traverse all these different things throughout the environment. We map it after the attack.
Yeah.
But we have the capacity, we have the capability to map it before the attack. And when you do that, you can then start going, well, here's how I break the attack path.
Right.
And then when I break that, how many variants of that attack path get broken? And then walk your way back up into what are the 50 instances of log4j that I need to patch that are in a path to an exploitable set of conditions that leads to a material risk, instead of what I've heard from a lot of peers with log4j. We wrestled, we got this, we got that. We spent a week churning and finally said, screw it, we got to patch it all. Why? Because CISA says it's actively exploited, and the SEC said if you don't, it's going to be a problem.
Right.
Because nobody could figure it out. And but we have the capacity.
I got to tell you a great story. So I went to RSA in 2012 to work on the strategy for Archer. And this was right after the NetWitness acquisition, right? So we had this great data coming in from NetWitness. We have Archer sitting on the top. So what I pitched to Art Coviello at the time was tuck in a piece in between Archer and NetWitness that allowed you to visualize the attack paths and the vulnerabilities and use that as a way to do exactly what you said, right? And the players back then, and there's these couple of these companies are still around. It was Red Seal Networks, Sky High Networks, it was Core Impact. Like they had some of these capabilities, but I could never convince them to bring that piece in to correlate the risk data, even though probably qualitative out of Archer, with real data on the network to be able to visualize where those pinch points were in the network and go after those and fix those and mitigate the risk.
I totally agree with you. Well, I think, possibly back then we didn't have the advancements in machine learning.
Yeah,
we
correct.
didn't have some of those things. But if you think of what Google Maps does, you go, here's the destination. I'm God knows where, but how do I get from here to there? And what's the most efficient and expedient route to get there?
Right.
Well, we've been doing that with navigation mapping now, and we all have it on our phones and everything else, walking through the city of San Francisco, finding this, finding that.
Right.
It's I need a core set of data. I need to ingest it. I need to understand the context of that and understand those relationships. And it takes a certain mindset, somebody who's been an attacker, somebody who has an offensive background, somebody who thinks as somebody who goes, that's the prize, and I'm going to weasel my way through the environment with the least amount of detection to get there. Right. And with that mindset, with the right things, you can do it. It's my passion. It's really the opportunity to take a leap forward in risk management when we adopt the technology that will allow us to do it.
Exploitability is interesting. How many people want to know the exploitability data that they are potentially exploited? How much is being watered down because they just don't want to know?
Well, it's a great question. So on Monday, I led a panel discussion on integrity matters. I had Juan Gomez Sanchez from Whirlpool. I had Pamela Fusco from Splunk. I had Jerry Davis from Pacific Gas and Electric. We had a very open and honest dialogue around the integrity of the role.
Right.
And the pressures that the CISO and some on the security team face at times to water down or dilute the risk issues. I know I've felt that pressure at times, and when my management has done things, you kind of pause and you go, hey, are you giving me coaching to manage the message, or are you giving me coaching to massage the message? There's a difference, and they're subtle.
Yeah.
And so I think, practitioners need to be wary of that and ask that question. And if it's, I don't think it's appropriate to share that in front of the board. Well, why?
Right.
Why is that? Their job is governance. Their job is management of material risk and fiduciary accountability and all those type of things. I did a survey back a year and a half ago on this, got over 100 respondents, InfoSec directors, CISOs. Over 100 of us said that 76% of us, so 76% of the person accountable and charged with managing information security has either watered down risk or been asked to. And that is an appalling stat.
Because if you think about it from a board perspective, most of these boards don't have expertise. They really have to rely on the CISO to come in and help educate them where the risks are. And if it gets watered down, then how is the board supposed to help and make sure that the right things are getting done? Because this comes down to potential reputational risk. It comes down to making sure you have enough budget to go address this stuff. Like, I just don't think it makes sense these days with all the high-profile breaches to stick your head in the sand.
Yeah, and it's amazing, but it still happens. So again, another stat: 61% of corporate directors, National Association of Corporate Directors, had polled board directors. 61% of them said they would compromise on cybersecurity for the sake of a business objective. Now, being a former finance person and you have to take risks to manage business, on the one hand, you could say, okay, well, that could make sense. But on the other hand, if it's being watered down, maybe that's the reason why they're willing to compromise on it.
Right.
Another study from about a year ago, and I can't remember the source, it may have been ISSA, they had polled not only the business executives, but the cybersecurity professionals around their confidence in information security. 84% of business executives said they were confident in their cybersecurity. 31% of the practitioners said they were confident in their cybersecurity.
Yeah, there's
so
a
you
disconnect.
have this disconnect, and I go, how do you bridge that gap, right? I think we can do it with an articulation around exploitability and not, log4j this and this and all this stuff. It's like, what would create a material risk for the business, its customers, and the brand? Once you do that and you have line of sight to those triggers, we did it with Sarbanes-Oxley over 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? What's a material risk for financial integrity, financial reporting? Yeah, and we struggled with it. I know because
in the early days, yes.
In the early days, I know I led that effort at Intel on the system side. But you look at it and you go, okay, 20-ish years later, we don't have the financial integrity issues and reporting issues that we did. I've advocated, and I did the other day in a group meeting with the Cyber Defenders Council, that we should put in place the equivalent of a Sarbanes-Oxley for cybersecurity, where the management team, the CFO, the general counsel, the CEO,
they gotta sign off.
And the chief information security officer need to sign to attest to the fact that their internal controls are sufficient to prevent a material weakness or significant deficiency that would harm the shareholders and their customers. So it not only means to be the operating of the technology, but the creators of the technology also have to do that as well.
Yeah.
If we did that, I think we would
Things
make
would
a
change.
massive shift.
Oh, yeah.
And guess what that would do? That would drive accountability to the industry, drive accountability to the management team, but also drives accountability to the CISOs. And the one thing that irks the crap out of me is when CISOs go, well, management accepted the risk or this or that, and they don't want to be held accountable for their role. They just go, well, I didn't have the budget, I didn't have this, somebody accepted it's not my responsibility. I'm like, darn well better be your responsibility, because if it's not yours, who is it?
Right. No, this has been the challenge for a long time in this industry. It's we have work to do for sure. But Malcolm, it's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks for joining me. And with that, folks, we are done with our executive interviews for RSA Conference 2022. We have one wrap-up show left. Thank you for joining us. Welcome back to RSA Conference 2022. We are recording live at the Marriott Marquis. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me for this interview segment is Paul McKay. He is Principal Analyst at Forrester. Paul, welcome to San Francisco.
Thank you very much for having me.
When was the last time you were here?
The last time I was here was actually at RSA in 2020. It seems very strange when we consider that was probably the last time that many of us actually went on a business trip, and this is certainly my first time to the US since then. So it's great to be back.
Yeah, it's my first time back to San Francisco since that exact same conference. We were recording Broadcast Alley. After the show, my wife and I went up to wine country for the weekend. We leave on Sunday and everything shuts down literally the next day. And a lot of us have not been back here since. So it's great to be back in person.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very different being in person to being
on
a virtual background or the bookcase that
yes.
everybody has behind them.
Yes, exactly right. Yes, that is for sure. So your research touches on a few different areas, but we're going to talk about vendor consolidation, platform consolidation,
yes.
Probably more specifically, right? So we talk about consolidation a lot. We talk about it on my podcast, for example, Business Security Weekly, where we know CISOs have lots of different tools. They have lots of different vendors. They're looking for consolidation. But is it actually happening?
The reality is that it's not. And the thing that I found really interesting is that my customers, based both in Europe and also in other parts of the world as well, talk a good game about consolidation. They know they're spending too much money. They know they've got too many security tools. They know that none of them talk to each other, and it's they know that it's making a huge management overhead and heartache for them. And they know that the board are coming down on them like a ton of bricks on this wasteful spending. But I don't think that people understand how to do it. I think they're worried about, if I consolidate, do I open myself up to new risks? And I don't think they've worked out how to bridge the gap between the IT demand to rationalize and integrate with the wider enterprise architecture and IT environment with how that impacts the security landscape that they've got to protect against. So there's still a lot of behaviors around best of breed purchasing. And, hands up as an analyst who publishes Waves, I've probably got something to say for that.
Right.
But I think the second thing I would say is that those aspects around integration are not really considered in the purchasing decisions for security solutions. So I think that's one kind of reason why we're seeing a lot of talk about it. We've seen a lot of vendors that have come out with very strong consolidation plays, particularly Microsoft and Palo Alto, I would say, that are the ones that come up most strongly.
Right.
But from my perspective, it's still a pipe dream on a to-do list somewhere, rather than something that people are actively doing something about. But it's clear that the drivers for making them do something about it are coming through too strongly now. So it's on the to-do list for every CISO I talk to in my kind of core region of Europe.
So it gets interesting, right? Because you've seen some very interesting consolidation around certain, I would call, platform vendors, right? Palo Alto's made a lot of acquisitions. Checkpoint's made a lot of acquisitions. Cisco, not as many as recently, but Cisco was in the spree for a long time, consolidating different parts of the portfolio across. So does best in breed still win at a purchasing decision, or is it best of breed plus the ability to potentially be a platform play? Like, does it change your decisioning in a procurement cycle, if you are a broader platform, but I'm not ready to roll you out as a broader platform, does that help influence the initial purchasing decisions for some customers?
Yes, I think the thing that's coming through much more strongly with some customers, which I think is the right way to think about this, is that some are looking at it not from a best of breed mentality, but from a best of need or a best of platform perspective. So there's a couple of little things going on here. One is, do we already have investments? So the best example of this is probably Microsoft in E5 has led to a lot of acquisition of Microsoft portfolio. But secondly, it's not the case necessarily uniquely that platform vendors means that you have to sacrifice on the quality of the underlying solution. So one of the things I would say, generally, not exclusively in all of our evaluations, but some of the platform vendors, the ones that are doing most well and winning this battle, so to speak, have actually improved the core capability of the individual products and the way in which they integrate with the rest of the platform portfolio to a point where they're maybe not in the top right of whichever analyst firm's evaluations you choose to use, but they're almost there. And when the difference between these solutions and maybe the one that is the furthest to the right and above is so minimal, you can't really justify having a different solution. So people are kind of getting to the point where some of the products are actually good solutions in their own right. Individually for the whatever area of security that the buyer is looking to acquire in. So this is meaning that we're getting to a situation where I think looking at the broader portfolio and how it plays into a more cohesive integration story is starting to become more of the picture, because they're thinking, well, I'm not necessarily having to sacrifice on the quality of the protection I'm getting. So you're seeing that happen more and more, where it's not just about it's got to be the best solution that protects or detects or responds to this threat in the best manner. It's, is it good enough to meet my business needs? And good enough doesn't mean sacrificing for second, third, or fourth best. But does it meet my needs? And is it maybe the case that some of the differential that I'm looking at is really pretty minimal or non-existent?
Because when you first saw some of these consolidation plays come down, the solutions weren't fully integrated yet, or they didn't have all the features of the pure plays, right? But as that improves, that influences the buying decisions because it's good enough and it integrates with the rest of my investment. Because I think about multiple vendors in the space that started in one side of the house or the other, but have acquired products to cover more capabilities. And when you look at them now, you're like, well, those are strong enough. This works. You know, the example I go back to a little bit is Fortinet, right? You know, I knew Fortinet as a firewall provider first and foremost, with some interesting capabilities that differentiated them slightly over some of the other firewall players. Fortinet has a ton of capabilities under the covers in what they've built out, but I don't think a lot of people know it. So as a platform provider, how well do they market their other capabilities? How important are they in the decisions? Because I'll take Palo Alto on the opposite side for a second. Prisma Cloud, Cortex, and Palo Alto all have very strong kind of definitive brands around the whole Palo Alto environment, different than Fortinet. But my guess is maybe they're not equivalent in capabilities, but they're both going after the same kind of platform play, right? And so that's very interesting is, you know, how important is it that you even market some of those capabilities in the decisioning process?
I think the thing I would come back to, and this is something that we get asked a lot about as analysts, is how does our go-to-market messaging resonate with customers? And I think the thing I would say is the case for most of the platform vendors is that they still market their products on individual or brand-based, you know, obviously Prisma Cloud is an accumulation of different capabilities, for example. They're still marketing based on individual functionalities and features. So if I take the Microsoft portfolio, for example, I've frequently said that it reads like a list of features and products rather than a cohesive integrated story. And I think that's really one of the things that I think all of the platform vendors need to improve upon is how do they create a compelling end-to-end story in such a way that a CISO can understand the value proposition they get both from the individual component parts on their own, but also together. But the thing I'd maybe want to come back to, which we haven't discussed yet, is we often talk about how does it integrate with the rest of the platform,
Right.
but it's very rarely the case that any of my customers are going to allow Microsoft to come in and paint the town a particular shade of blue, or Cisco a lighter shade of blue, or
Right.
Palo Alto a shade of orange.
Right.
They've got to operate within the context of which solutions already exist. Because when I'm talking to clients about consolidation programs, the very few who are actually doing it, they're looking at their individual capabilities. They're looking at things from a capability perspective and saying, where are aspects of what we're doing duplicative? We can eliminate those quite safely.
Right.
Where are we actually going to keep something?
Right.
And the business decision that the platform vendors need to make is, how do we enable both our individual component parts to talk with the rest of the platform, but also with CISO's existing investments?
Right.
Because the reality is that defense in depth is not going to go away anytime soon. And you're not going to get CISOs ripping up, say, for example, 3 years worth of investment on building a privileged identity management capability
Right.
to junk it for something else.
Or an endpoint capability.
Or an endpoint capability. So
Right.
I think this is kind of one of those things that the idea that the platform providers can say, hey, there's an API here, we can get customers to build the integrations
Right.
themselves, that's
Yeah.
just not good enough.
Right. So then you bring the marketplace concept to bear, right? Which
Yeah.
is these platform providers have to have out-of-the-box integrations with popular other capabilities that CISOs might have in the portfolio to integrate those into the platform plays. And endpoint is one of those areas that I could see. You know, you've got great endpoint technologies out there, and some people will die on that hill,
Of
right?
course I will.
Right? And so having those connectors to bring it into the rest of the platform are going to be key in the purchasing decision as well. Because we all know creating your own one-off integration through the existing APIs is not easy.
No, it's not. And I think for the most part, CISOs shouldn't be in the business of having to maintain their own development staff in which to do so.
Right,
Now,
exactly.
of course, they maybe have developers in the wider organization they can call upon, but that shouldn't be their core business. Their core business is to try and help secure their organization, not to act as an outsourced development shop for platform vendors. Now, to take the other side for a minute, some of the platform vendors will say, but hey, Paul, we've already got marketplaces. And that's true that many of them do. But I think the concept needs to evolve to such an extent where that just becomes a standard requirement across the security landscape. Nobody needs another single pane of glass.
Right. Yeah, and it's not just a one-way integration. It's really a bi-directional integration because you want to leverage the features of the tool you're integrating and vice versa and leverage that data. And I think sometimes we think about these integrations as a one-way in because I want to be the single pane of glass, but in reality, you're not. And so if you don't allow the other tools that you're integrating to also leverage their capabilities and benefits, then you kind of limit the integration point.
Of course. And I think to some extent, some people treat this as a one-way exchange of data from one platform to the other. But I think, and I know I promised in the run-up to this outside Matt that I wouldn't get into the topic of XDR.
Right.
But I guess one of the things you see in that concept is people are kind of saying, okay, yes, there's the detection element, pulling the data from that, but in principle, you should also be able to trigger a response action
Correct.
to remediate or contain a threat. Now, that for me is a very valuable aspect that we need to think of in terms of those integrations themselves, which is still in its infancy, but I think we'll see more and more of that coming through in the coming months and years.
Yes. Not that there won't be a lot of XDR signage around San Francisco this week.
Of course not. Of course you can. You can't move for XDR signs. I guess XDR is the new zero trust.
Yes.
As far as
I do want to touch on that briefly.
Okay.
Because if you think about a platform play and you think about the core principles of zero trust architecture produced by NIST, right? I imagine that does create some guidance for organizations to think about what would a zero trust platform look like in the integration or the capabilities to underlie user, app, network, device, and data security, right? And so does that play in the decisioning process for organizations yet, or is zero trust still too early? I mean, in the U.S. federal government, it's an executive order mandate. What we have not seen is necessarily that same level of adoption on the commercial side. But does zero trust architectures play into also aspects of the platform discussion?
So I'll I'll give an example of what I'm seeing in Europe. So I'm doing some work at the moment on an implementation program with some customers in Europe for Forrester. Now, what I would say is that from a Forrester perspective, we very much align with the view that NIST have, that it's about all of those different dimensions around zero trust. And certainly some of my colleagues in the past have looked at platform vendors from the perspective of how do they build capabilities that allow you to implement zero trust from end to end.
Right.
Now, I think the reality is that most of those platform providers may or may not have gaps in certain parts of that picture, and some of them are trying to fill those in. But I think from my perspective, what I'm seeing in practice is that one of the vendors in particular, and I'm a little bit reluctant to say this, but it is Microsoft, is the one that's being used more often by my customers in Europe, because they've got the investment in Azure.
Yep.
Now, in Europe, we're very behind in terms of our adoption of cloud platforms because of concerns around data sovereignty. But we're starting to see a massive shift towards cloud in Europe, accelerated by the pandemic. So lots of clients are moving in that space and are undertaking cloud transformations. And the zero trust security model happens to be quite nice in terms of its ability to secure that underlying transformation. And what I'm seeing from that perspective is that when Microsoft are coming to the table of the platform play, they're saying, well, we're going to be your main cloud provider, and we also have this security capability that allows you to implement a zero trust architecture. It's proving to be quite compelling. Now, that's not to say that there are not other providers that Palo Alto couldn't come in and make a similar case and also sell a similar thing. But I have to say that from a commercial perspective, that's the one I'm seeing that's having the most success, as much as it pains me to say that, to give any vendor credit for anything.
Yes, I understand. So zero trust and XDR, we should see lots of signage for both of those around the conference this week?
Probably.
Okay.
I would expect so.
Paul, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
And thank you everyone for watching and listening. We'll be back with more interviews soon.